As we were doing our prep calls, we were talking about both of your backgrounds, and you have you work for very different companies, but it turns out both of you have a history in the aerospace industry. Yeah. Neither one of you are there now, but like, I say that because I wanted the audience to know that, like, as you're explaining your companies and your approach to climate tech, I think you'll see some of the patterns in there and some of the engineer's mindset. So it's been fascinating. But I mean, I think one of the things that's very common is, like, you're both looking at things from a very systems-oriented approach. So maybe we'll start with that sort of systems thinking and how it informs how each of your companies are handling this problem. And Karthik, we'll start with you.
Yeah, one of the big challenges we've seen. So actually, we build software for really for CFOs and capital planning teams to understand how are they going to tackle the climate challenge, resilience challenge, within not just the four walls of their business, but within their supply chains, and all of this stuff is interdependent, right? So that's really been a big focus for us: is how do you make the invisible visible, and how do you make it possible for someone who may be very financial, who has to sign that $1 billion check, to really grapple with the hard problems that are very scientific, very technical, very geospatial, that are really place and space and time dependent. And what ends up happening is you start to go into detail about what these systems are. If you think about a couch and you want to decarbonize, you want a net zero couch, you have to decarbonize mining. You have to decarbonize the timber industry, the wool industry, the leather industry. It's all about systems. Everything layers on top of each other. And I think just coming from the aerospace world, you start to realize actually everything is a system. Everything is linked together. If you can't make the complexity workable for an individual to say, I'm going to sign that $1 billion check, nothing's going to happen. Yeah.
And Brendan?
Well, you brought up the aerospace thing, and we're near and dear to my heart. I worked at NASA Ames, sort of behind us, for like, I was watching like this whole thing get built as I was driving past the whole hotel. Yeah. So the aerospace lens I have is, I was making systems that would measure greenhouse gas from space, right? Which is cool, but super depressing because you can't do anything, right? Like we heard about that earlier. In fact, It's like a lot of that is relatively inactionable unless somebody else does something. The other lens that's sort of interesting when you look at greenhouse gas emissions from space is that we talk about greenhouse gas emissions like they're really well mixed in the atmosphere. And they are in the upper atmosphere, but down at ground level, as we saw somewhat earlier, it's incredibly heterogeneous. And if you want to go and reduce the total amount of greenhouse gases staying in the atmosphere as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible, well, you go to where there's a lot. And guess where there's a lot? It's where the people are, right? Like we're the ones who are doing we're the ones who are burning, we're the ones who are leaking, we're the ones who are emitting. So if you want to have a very efficient way of reducing greenhouse gases, go to the people. And that's what Phalo Labs does, is that we make a platform that allows you to decarbonize the built environment. And our main goal is to accelerate the path not just to net zero, but to net negative, where we can actually turn the facilities that we have created, this beautiful infrastructure, into a carbon sink.
So built environment is another word for buildings.
Yeah, that's code word.
Code word for buildings.
Code word for buildings.
And we said it during the transportation panel, which was not really about transportation. Hope nobody noticed. But that was 27%. Let's see how you noticed. 27% of CO2 emissions in the U.S. Globally, the built environment, buildings consume about 40% of CO2 emissions. But maybe talk a little bit about, the building that we're in now is actually pretty green and pretty new. But like, talk to us a little bit about what a traditional building, how it's heated, how it works, and then where Phalo's solution comes in, which is very much hardware oriented.
Yeah. So the traditional shtick is the built environment is responsible for the second largest source of global greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's actually potentially higher than that because we're not currently tracking refrigerant loss, which is going to be coming as a thing that we should be worried about as soon as humanly possible. And by the way, it's important also to differentiate between ongoing operations of buildings, heating and cooling the buildings, versus actually the construction and all of the embodied carbon, right? Those are kind of two different ones. I'll focus really on that first one of building operations, heating and cooling the buildings. In places, and the answer is it depends on where you are. Places like New York City, it's not the second largest, it's super dominant. Over 70% of the emissions in places like New York last year it came not from transportation or from agriculture or from anything else. It was just heating and cooling the buildings and the people who are living in them. So where do those emissions come from? Because that's like potentially very surprising, right? You don't normally think about that when you're walking around a city. It's like actually most of the emissions are coming from the buildings you're walking past. Well, a lot of it comes from one of the main scopes, right? The direct emissions, which is where you're taking in, for example, natural gas or heating oil, and you're combusting it. You get hot or cold in some cases, like gas-powered chillers, but you get what you want, plus a bunch of extra CO2, right, from the combustion process. However, you could also be leaking. That's a scope 1 emission. That's a direct emission that's coming out of your building. That can be everywhere from combustion products like a natural gas all the way through refrigerant, right? So even if you have a fully electric building, you may well have considerable amounts of scope 1 emissions, which we need to deal with. When we traditionally think about decarbonizing buildings, we're talking about electricity, right? Which is you flip on the switch for your air conditioner, you get cold out, that's nice, and heat pumps, you can get hot out. But you're not the one actually making that electricity in most cases. The power plant or PG&E out here, it's Con Ed in New York, they're the ones who are emitting, burning dinosaurs to make that power. That scope 2 emissions is like one of the best success stories in terms of climate in the last like 20 years. Like we've reduced the amount per building with all the LED lights. When you say that this building is very, very green, you're right? And that's like celebrating those last 2 decades of wins. We've never really looked at that for scope 1, for those direct emissions, because it hasn't been incentivized. People, if you don't care about your emissions or gas is cheap, why do it? Well, the time is now, and actually it is becoming delightfully incentivized as time progresses.
So I've got another statistic here. All these statistics, they all are these huge numbers. 80% of CO2 emissions are the result of a supply chain. Obviously, those are not independent numbers, but like, Karthik, you're really looking at your approach is really to look at that entire supply chain for every industry and be able to visualize exactly where the emissions are, and then how to put capital against making those goals. Can you just talk us through the product a little bit?
Yeah, the 80% number is interesting because no matter how you slice and dice it, you end up with something really close to 80%, and this is true really across industries. And it's true even if you look at industries that are not typically something you think of as having a supply chain. So you think about a utility, for example, right? Utilities you conveniently bucket into a scope 2. Okay, I'm buying electricity, I'm buying gas, it's my scope 2. But that's the utility's scope 1, and they have their own scope 2 and 3, right? And it's just like this nested doll kind of a thing. What we're really focused on is essentially kind of stripping away some of that nomenclature where people are trying to work, is it my scope 2, do I have to worry, is it my scope 3, do I care about this or not? And just saying, these are the assets that are in the real world that are contributing to your footprint. And then here's the options that you have at an asset by asset level in a geospatial way to actually see the impacts that you're trying to have, whether it's decarbonization. We've done work around things like bringing broadband to rural communities, right? So not everything is purely about decarbonization. A lot of it is about social and other kind of impacts. But here's the capital needed to invest in that asset to make that thing happen. And here's the different pathways you have to do that. And what ends up happening for really a lot of CFOs and a lot of capital planning folks is the complexity just starts to mount. So for example, if you are a utility and you're looking at a neighborhood, and that neighborhood you've got people buying induction stoves and electric cars, you're starting to think about this circuit's going to have a lot more demand on it. So now I've got to go and invest in substations. I've got to go and upgrade the circuits. Maybe I have to do dynamic line rating. Maybe I have to start building new transmission lines. You've got someone else in the business who's now thinking about weatherization. Maybe if 50% of the homes are inadequately insulated, maybe you don't need to build a bunch more capacity. You just need to blow some insulation in the walls so they're using less electricity for heating and cooling, and now you have more capacity. A lot of that lives in different parts of these big organizations, and we're bringing all that into one spot. And that's true, within an organization where it's, hey, this is within my scope 1 in my 4 walls, or it's actually going out beyond into a supply chain. It's really kind of one and the same, which is you have a lot of real world assets that are really complicated to kind of visualize and understand and play with. As soon as you make it tactile for someone to realize, they can start to say, you know what, $1 here makes sense, $1 here doesn't make sense. Here's where I can move today and actually go and sign that $1 billion check.
So how are you building that model? Like it seems like it's just the scale of it,
Yep.
Even in a small example, which we've talked about a little bit, the scale seems so immense. Like, how do you build a model that has that many inputs that then allows you to put capital against the solution?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's always this tendency, a lot of companies run into this problem where they amass huge amounts of data, right? It's like we have a data lake, and then what ends up happening is you drown in the data lake because you don't know what to do with it, and you're just and one of the big problems, data is very useful and very important, but data has, there's frequency, there's resolution, there's age, there's all of these attributes around the data, and fundamentally, if you don't have the right data, you get stuck. So we always start with what we call essentially a broken plan. And we call it a broken plan because what ends up happening is for a lot of these large organizations, it gives the people in the company something to object to. They can say, well, that's wrong. Okay, great, fix it. And it's a really interesting way for the senior executives to come in and bring folks in and say, this is kind of the plan, here's the thing, but we've got to do the coloring by numbers. We've got to bring that in. And at that point, you get a nice data shopping list. You start to say, well, in order to make the case close for a hydrogen charging, for an EV charging network or for hydrogen electrolyzers to power, to feed into trucks or what have you, here's the data that's necessary to make that decision, right? So you start with, it's almost like stone soup, right? It would be nice if we had this, we'd nice if we had that, and you give something for folks to rally around, and you bring them together, and that solves kind of the chicken and the egg problem. Because it turns out that for some parts of these plans, you're actually ready to kick them off today. There's enough information, and there's some things that the technologists won't be ready for another 5 or 10 years. So there's no point having all the data and the models today. You just need to get there by the time the technology is ready. So it's a bit of kind of playing with the typical organizational pattern of, that's wrong. Okay, great, fix it.
So can you give us some examples of companies you've worked with or organizations? Because it's almost it's a SaaS product. And the interface is great. You can just go to the website, check it out. Yeah. But talk a little bit about how the plan works in action with real clients.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. It's actually, it doesn't seem like a sustainability decarbonization project until you kind of go under the covers. So we've done quite a bit of work with UNICEF. UNICEF is a program to connect every single school in the world to high-speed broadband by 2030. One of the big challenges is, number one, they don't even know where all the schools are. And when I say they, I don't just mean UNICEF. I mean a lot of countries don't know where all their schools are. So first, where are the schools? How many kids go there? Sometimes it's seasonal. Number two, is there electricity or not? If there is it connected to the grid? Is there a diesel generator or a gas generator? So we essentially made it possible for all the different experts within the UNICEF ecosystem, in the ITU ecosystem, to come in, bring their models, bring their data. And what they've been able to do now is, in about 40 countries, over 2 million buildings, build a capital plan. And they've actually, at this point, deployed about $500 million, connected 1 million schools. But the reason they've been able to do that, instead of going site by site and trying to do things manually, we've essentially, automated, brought in AI-driven optimizers, things like that. So it becomes very simple and straightforward for someone who's very financially minded to make decisions that are rooted in extremely technical decisions around fiber routing and battery sizing and things like that.
So now I'm going to try and I'm trying to do a transition between the software guy and the hardware guy, and ask the hardware guy, what would an organization like NYCHA do with a tool like Actual if they wanted to clean up their housing, their buildings? And I guess for this crowd, you probably have to explain what NYCHA is, the scale of it, and what you would recommend.
Yeah, and I don't think it's very healthy for us to get into this hardware software thing.
Good,
what we need.
It's good content. I'm sorry.
It's good content, but it's also there's the problem, capital P problem we're trying to solve is that there's too much greenhouse gases staying in the atmosphere. It's kind of it, right? It's not any smarter than that. Yeah. The problem, little p problem that is causing all this pain and suffering is that's not actually any company's real problem, right? They care about it, but they have other problems that they have to deal with. It's their gas bill or their electricity bill, or they have to look good in their ESG report, right? So maybe I'll go into more detail on why. This is, I think, an example of some of the stuff that we can certainly help with, right? So NYCHA is the New York City Housing Authority. It's the projects. It's a very interesting structure. If I believe the statistic is, if it was its own city, it would be the 5th largest city in the U.S. And all 5 boroughs of New York City, not including the 6th borough, which is Miami. They have, I think it's 12,000 boilers. And there's, they have a lot of challenges in making sure that not only are those boilers ideally clean and eventually decarbonized, but that they're on, right? And that they're actually doing the thing that they need to do, which is like keep people alive in the winter when it's cold out, which is happening somewhat less frequently these days, but it's still a problem. The way we like to think about this is that, you talked about data a lot. By the way, I have some really dumb stickers that say it's all scope 1 somewhere.
Yep.
And I'm going to hand out after this,
That's
because it's
good.
true, right? It's like, we like to think about this sort of missing data gap of between the real world, the analog world of like emissions and leakage, and where the hell are those assets? Like what is there out there? And what everyone wants to do, which is action. And a lot of what we do at Thalo is really solve that middle gap. And a lot of it is about this data gap of greenhouse gas flux, but it of course includes some other components of just what assets and how are they operating. Because without solving that, you end up saying, well, some CEO stands up and says, I'm gonna cut emissions by 50% by 2030, or we're gonna be net zero by, and then you say, okay, great, you have 100 boilers, what are you gonna do? Which one do you rip out now? And I think a lot of these next generations of decarbonization technologies, whether they're hardware or software or whatever, right? A lot of what we do is software, it's enabled by hardware. This next generation of the companies is trying to solve exactly that problem. So now we're trying to get incredibly tactical and say, if we're going to be surgical with decarbonization dollars, how do we do that?
So to the extent that both of you are also operating in the software space, like how are you deploying AI? Like you can sort of specifically, how are you using it today and how do you expect to use it in the future?
So we think about AI very much like power steering, not autopilot. Again, the capital P problem, it's a real world problem. We're burning stuff and putting CO2 in the atmosphere. Just using AI by itself doesn't solve that. But what it does is it takes fundamentally AI is really good at cutting through noise, finding correlations where correlations may not be immediately visible, stitching data sets together, filling in gaps, doing all this kind of stuff. And so where we use AI especially is around large-scale optimization, where you have your toolbox of options, you have thousands or millions of sites. There's no way that an organization is going to be able to figure out, to your point about you have 100 boilers, which one are you going to rip out? Well, which one are you going to rip out, right? That tends to be, when people talk about, techno-economic analysis that lasts for months and months and years, that's what they're doing, is going through one by one and saying, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? What's the IRR? What's the this and that? A lot of that human process can be simplified to get to the point where you say, of the 100 boilers, these 5 are probably good ones. Now let's focus on that and see which one we really want to do. So that's what we really focus on, is using AI to make the expert, really focus on what they're an expert at, not on the kind of the manual drudgery of cutting and pasting and moving numbers around and the fun part of Excel.
Brandon, you want the last word?
Sure. I mean, I actually agree with that. We also have found it very useful on our investor decks. Once we put it in, everything gets a lot easier.
ThaloLabs.ai?
Yeah, perfect. But I think that the answer is actually very similar, and I'll maybe, we have some ML models that run on device that actually do some of the spectral deconvolution. Like that's a cool avenue to do it, and that's only recently coming out of some of the self-driving cost stuff, which I worked on previously. But I think that to piggyback on what you said is like we're just missing a little bit more information, and then you don't have to have a sensor in every tailpipe in the world. You have to have enough of them. And once you have enough, then you can be really like totally unfair in terms of advantage of being able to drive decarbonization. So I agree 100%.
Very cool. Well, we're about an hour away from our town hall. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions in the audience, but I think we should push into the town hall to listen to hear them. Hopefully all of you have cards. You can submit those, or you can just raise your hand when we do the town hall. But thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.